Hello, everybody. I'm Allison Gilmore from the Winnipeg Free Press. I'd like to thank you for tuning in to this new technological format for the First Friday Art Talk. I'm not much good at tech, so I'm very fortunate to have Winnipeg media artist Colby Richardson, who also co-runs a company called Collective Broadcast Co., who's handling the show here. The pandemic has temporarily made our usual in-person gathering in the exchange impossible, but everyone at First Friday temporarily, we feel that art is even more important than ever right now, and our guest tonight, Winnipeg intermedia artist Seema Goel, who is also trained as a scientist, will be talking about the relationship between art and science, and that also feels really crucial right now. One of the things that Seema has been discussing with me is the idea that, yes, scientists, they have lots of data, but one of the things that science can learn from art and from collaborating with artists is how to communicate that data and how to get it out into the world to non-science citizens. So thanks to everybody, thanks to you, thanks to Colby, to Seema, and to everyone who's checking this out. I just want to briefly introduce Seema, and then we'll get right into our conversation. Seema is a Saskatchewan-born, Winnipeg-based intermedia artist, curator, and writer. She has a BSc in biology, specifically ecology from McGill, where she did field work in the Amazon. Then she turned toward the arts at OCAD, studying glass blowing, among other things, and later completing an MFA at the Rhode Island School of Design. She's also done graduate work in engineering and aesthetics. She's been artist in residence for the science faculty at the University of Manitoba, and then she became the coordinator for their STEAM program from 2016 to 2020, which brings the arts into science, tech, engineering, and math. So, Seema, thank you for joining us in this weird format. You're obviously the perfect person to talk about the relationship between art and science. So I thought we could maybe talk about some of the societal preconceptions first, and then blow them right up, basically. So historically, I'm just going to speak as an art historian there for a minute. There have been periods where science and art have had this really fruitful relationship, and the flowering of Islamic mathematics in the medieval period, and this incredible geometric tile patterns in mosque decoration, the Italian Renaissance, anatomy and perspective, that 19th century naturalist mania, that love of collecting and categorizing, that gave us that incredible pictorial record of birds by John James Audubon. So obviously there have been times when science and art have had this really fruitful relationship where they've worked to expand and enlarge each other, and they've connected. But then I think in the 20th century, maybe with a bit of a holdover from the Romantic period, maybe that modern tendency towards specialization, I think we started to sort of stereotype scientists as like smart, but like rigid and rational, too rational. And then artists as sort of creative, but also maybe sloppy and loopy, and we started seeing these two spheres as very separate, maybe even adversarial. And for you, obviously, that's not true. So can you talk about how you see the relationship between art and science at this moment?
Sure. So first, I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this, and welcome everybody to this strange way that we're meeting now. It's exciting. It's so weird, but it's always delightful. And art and science obviously are very dear subjects for me, and they're things that I've invested pretty much my whole life in. And in particular, that collaboration component. So my first image that I'm putting up is actually a thing to think about how art and science really, from my point of view, are about point of view. So there's a lot to do with how things interface, meaning how we connect to another idea, and then an opportunity to collaborate across disciplines so that we can see another perspective.
Okay.
And whether or not we accept something as art or as science often depends on what that interface is
Mm-hmm.
and how we're looking through it. I don't know if I'm being very clear there,
Mm-hmm.
but for me, they are very wedded. They have tons of similarities.
Mm-hmm.
Art and science both require, and I'm talking about like real science, not like I'm just, I don't know, not just the technical side of it, right? So there is a lot of technique in science, and that's, you know, measuring, learning how to collect data, following method, being rigorous, all those kinds of things. But those are really about strong technical skills so that the data is reliable.
Right.
But actually going past that, once people develop a kind of vocabulary of whatever their discipline is, then they want to write with it or make poetry with it, whatever it is. And so that requires play and risk and the ability to redistribute how we put those words together. You know, in an unusual way, it requires people to look at something they think they know really well and then find new questions in it, or see areas where they thought a thing was going to, you know, X was going to lead to Y, but weirdly it led to Q this time. And then pausing to say, oh, this led to Q. What's so interesting about Q?
Yeah, and then follow that kind of, yeah. So they both use risk and rigor, you know, rather than, you talked about the idea that they're both pulling on the string, the same string, but from different ends sometimes.
Yeah, so this is a metaphor that I came up with for an essay for Neurocraft, which was a project that the Craft Council put together, which connected neuroscientists and craftspeople. And as the curator, I had this lovely opportunity to chat with everybody, but then I had to write an essay at the end. And one of the ideas I settled on, or kept coming back to me, was that artists and scientists really, it's like they're on two different parts of a string and they're playing telephone a little bit. And they're feeling the same vibrations. Yeah. But they're looking at things from very, very different perspectives. And scientists tend, well, actually, what science does is it takes a whole bunch of data points. So it'll look at a lot of information of individual circumstances, right? So I'm most familiar with biology. So that's the place where I go to, although lots of scientists will tell you biology is not science. But anyway.
Wow, I didn't realize there's such a hierarchy.
Yeah, we're like sloppy, you know, we're covered in mud usually. I usually say I went from like being a biologist covered in mud to being a ceramics person covered in mud.
Also covered in mud, yeah.
Just mud. But what would happen is you'd look at a lot of different individual cases and then try and come up with a theory that would support all of that data where all of those cases fit into it. So you'd come up with some universal discovery, you know, to say like, oh, look, the lizards in this place have bigger toe pads because they're exposed to high winds. So there's a thing. So it takes a whole lot of individual data and it puts it into a conclusion that then can be thrust back like an umbrella conclusion. And artists do the opposite. So artists look at these big human universals, like issues of death or love or loss or, you know, conflict or whatever it is. And then they try and pull that experience out of the vast umbrella of human experience and make it apply to an individual moment that occurs between the viewer and the object. Right. And it's not actually the object. It's the thing that's happening between the viewer and the object. And so this, I mean, I have all these slides. I'm not sure how we're going to skip through the slides, but I could talk about a few of them if you want.
Yeah, well, let's start and let's look at Alexa
Wright.
Alexa Wright. Okay.
Yeah. So this is actually one of the earliest images that I encountered as an art student when I was an undergraduate, where art and science were working together. And having done a science degree and then gone into the arts, I was constantly struggling to figure out how I fit within either of these spaces, and that, you know, I had a lot of experience and information to draw upon, but then I didn't exactly know how it would what it could do in the world. And
Okay.
this was a series of very large scale photographs that Alexa did. And they were about, I'm guessing here, but they were enormous. So they were about 4 feet tall and maybe 3 feet wide. So they were overwhelming when we saw them.
Okay.
And she was
More than life size, yeah.
More than life size.
Okay.
And she's a UK artist, and she was commissioned by some neuropsychologists and neurologists to understand what phantom limb syndrome was about. And obviously the neuroscientists know a lot about phantom limb syndrome, and they work with all these patients. So what she did was she interviewed a whole series of people who had an experience with phantom limb, and then she created an image to represent that. And so in this image, we see an elderly man who's lost his upper right arm from above the elbow, but he can still feel his hand. And so in this piece, there was then a description of his relationship to his phantom limb.
Wow.
And what she did to create those photographs is she did a reflective process. So she took a photograph of his left hand and onto the image. And it allowed for this representation. And I don't know if this has any connection at all, but subsequent to this piece, there was some neurological work done, neuroscience work done with phantom limb patients where they would put them in front of a mirror where they could only see half their body. So they could see the normal part of their body, and then the other part where there was something traumatic had happened was sort of lost because there was a reflection. So it made them whole again.
Wow.
Subsequent to this. And then they would flex their hand, their hand that doesn't work anymore. They would flex the left, and in their eye, they would see the right, and they would have relief of whatever the pain was, because we don't really know how phantom limb works. Right. So I don't know that Alexa's work influenced that research, but it seemed like such an amazing coincidence, and also like a great way of rethinking what is happening in terms of that relationship. And in particular, it's this thing of the patient speaking. So, I haven't, sorry, go ahead.
Do you think it would help? I mean, obviously doctors and scientists are working with the scientific aspect of this, but would it help them see it as a human, maybe visualize it more clearly as a human issue, an emotional issue, a subjective issue? Maybe just have more empathy, perhaps, or.
Yeah, I mean, I think it helps on lots of levels. It helps medicine. It helps the public. It helps the people who are having this experience. It helps us with understanding differently abled people and different bodies. Right? Like I remember seeing this and having that kind of like, oh my God, that person doesn't have an arm thing, right? Where you're like, we all have a fear of amputation. And then you have to look at it, and then you have to read their story, and it's in their own words. So they become, it's extremely personal. And then all that anxiety just fades, where you recognize that this is a person who's gone through a trauma. So this is another one of her works, and you can see how she's manipulated the photograph to really illustrate what that person was experiencing. And the word illustrate is important here, because usually when art and science gets together, what happens is that scientists use artists to illustrate concepts. Right. And in this case, she's illustrating the mental experience, the emotional and physical experience of that patient, but it's not in the normal illustrative way.
No, I mean, you get all this neat information about, her favorite chair, and, it's.
That's exactly right. That's all
non-clinical information. Yeah. Okay.
So that's I think there are a lot of places where art and science can overlap, and they are usually, the really good stuff for me is usually in a really unusual place where we don't expect it, where it's not the concrete stuff, it's the conceptual, metaphoric stuff. And this is another nice example of somebody local. So this came out of the Craft Council piece again. Right. And Dana's mother had a stroke. So Dana Klepke is a local drawing, and she does actually lots of work, fiber, lots of different things. And she had this experience where her mom had a stroke, and then after the stroke, her behavior had changed. And her mom used to be very precise about things, like crisp, clean, everything. And one day they were folding laundry together, and when her mom was folding the washcloths, nothing matched. You know, like the corners didn't match anymore, and it was really weird. And she asked her mom about it. She's like, "Does that seem right?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's good." She put it away. And so Dana decided she did two things. One is she went and talked to one of the neuroscientists that she was working with about what this was. And then the other thing was that she decided to do these drawings that were just this weird part that was happening, you know, like the part where the fabric didn't fit together anymore. And when she spoke to the neuroscientist, that person said, that is clear frontal lobe damage. We know exactly what that means. And when she showed these drawings to me, for me, these were really fantastic art and science, because like it just cut right to the point of everything, to the change in her behavior, the change in her brain, the change in her biology, Dana's relationship to it, that really emotional thing of these tiny gestures we have with people.
Yeah.
So again,
and
it's
the
that
mother
thing of like,
daughter.
And so the interface here is like this washcloth, which seems so weird, but it's full of stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to tell me about, you can, just explain hyperbolic geometry.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide, because it has,
I guess there's this amazing overlap between craft often and really complex mathematical, in this case, hyperbolic geometry.
Right. So what's cool about hyperbolic geometry, I mean, there's lots of reasons that it's
many cool things,
sure. Hyperbolic geometry. Okay, so usually, now I'm not a mathematician. I'm married to a mathematician.
Yeah, exactly.
It actually doesn't mean anything. So one of the things, so this idea of hyperbolic geometry came about a long time ago, and this little slide references Gauss. So Gauss is one of them, you know, like the fathers, and there's lots of great stories about Gauss and how smart he was and how he used to like trick his elementary school teachers and things like that, because he was smarter than them, and it was great, and he would play pranks on them basically. But in any case, he theorized that there was this other way of creating space that would allow for a lot of surface area and very little volume. But more than that, it meant that you could have you could have parallel lines. Let me just see if I can get this right. It has to do with parallel lines that separate. So parallel lines are always supposed to go together.
Right.
Yes, but these ones can curve in space. These are curved parallel lines.
Oh,
that go and they fold. And so people were trying to model this. I haven't said this properly, so someone now has to go to the TED Talk. But anyway, people have been trying to model this for a very long time. Hundreds of years, people have been trying to figure out how you deal with this idea of hyperbolic space, hyperbolic geometry. And and people would try to make it out of paper and try and make it out of all these things. Now, it does happen that hyperbolic geometry exists in nature in abundance, but I guess math people were not talking to biology people. And one of the things that happened pretty recently, so maybe 20 years ago, there was a mathematician at Cornell, Dana Temima, who had to teach a hyperbolic geometry class. Okay? And she wanted to figure out how to model it for her students. And she looked at it, and it's fractal, so it continuously increases, right? So the first row of it is 5, and the next row is 7, the next row is 9, or however you want to do it. You can stack it in many different ways. But she looked at it, and she realized that it looked like a knitting pattern. Now, because she was a woman. It was gender moment. And she knew how to knit. And she recognized, it's not just like men can learn how to knit. It's nothing like that. It's just, it was in her upbringing, right?
Yeah.
But somewhere she'd learned to see this thing. So she saw it, and and she realized it looked like a knitting pattern, and she tried to knit it, and it became gigantic. And then she did it with crochet, which allows you to have really serious fractal ruffly spaces without having needles weighted down. And she learned how to knit hyperbolic geometry, and she won a big math award for this, because all of a sudden she could demonstrate that here were these parallel lines that where you could have these structures that had multiple parallel lines that curved in space and look like they should meet in Euclidean space, but in hyperbolic space they don't. And if you do one of these, and they're really easy, there's a million YouTube videos now. So if you do a little hyperbolic crochet, all you do is you start with a row of 10, and then for every stitch, just do a double crochet as you go back. And then and the next row, just keep going, double, double, double. Or you can go like one row the same and one row double, one row the same. Okay. And your thing expands. And then it starts by looking like that top image. Okay. And then it grows into this sort of brain structure.
Right.
Doesn't that look like a brain?
Yeah, it does look like a brain.
So when I saw that, so I made one, right? I immediately was like, I'm knitting this thing up. And and it actually mine even folded into the two hemispheres of the brain. Like it was a weird moment when I thought, oh my God, math, I'm getting hot flush with math. It was fantastic. It was so sexy. And this thing like just developed. And it made me understand so much the reason that nature moves in that direction, because you can have these massive surface areas where you can have gas exchange and a tiny, tiny volume. And so this idea was picked up on by two women, and it's Margaret Wertheim, and I don't know her sister's name. This is kind of funny because her sister is a mathematician. Yeah, it's two. But she always takes credit for this. But anyway.
Well, I don't have a sister, so I'm not going to get into that. I know you have a sister. Okay.
She has a sister. I forgot to put her name on it. But Margaret's sister is a mathematician. Right. And Margaret is the artist. And they started working on a project called the Coral Reef Project, where they created hyperbolic crochet pieces, and then they crowdsourced it. Yes,
I heard that. So like people were sending in stuff, and
it's amazing. I got to see it in Dublin in 2009, I think it was there, 2009. And I met them, and I was just about to work on a big public art piece in Ireland. And I wanted to figure out how do you get the public to do work with you? And the thing they told me was just like, let them take ownership of it. Let them lead it. Give them the tools that they need.
Right.
And then don't try and control it. And that philosophy of theirs has made the Hyperbolic Crochet Coral Reef Project global. So it's shown all over the world. I think it's showing in Ontario this fall at the ROM.
Oh, cool!
It is huge. It's amazing, and it's a lovely example of like making the art and science part of it, or the science part of it, very accessible.
Right.
Now, it doesn't mean it's really like, do I think anybody's really learning some science out of this? No one's learning any science. It doesn't matter. What we're learning is that we get to access this stuff that felt like we couldn't possibly access it before. Mm-hmm. And when you start to make these crazy coral structures, it does make you understand, like, oh my God, this is how biology works. It's got a mathematical root in it, and it's because nature is the best optimizer. And of course it's going to grow in a mathematical structure because math is optimized, right? Like, it makes perfect sense. If it didn't grow like that, that would be weird. So when people are astonished that something is like that flowers are mathematical, they shouldn't be astonished. If they weren't mathematical, that would be weird.
Okay. Okay. All right. That's good to know. So just talking about like this back and forth, and you did this incredible art science collaboration that you curated called Neurocraft. So it was 9 kind of craft-based artists, working in all interesting mediums, and then 9 neuroscientists, and you kind of match made them, right? And really interesting things came out of that. And then, you know, here in Winnipeg, there's been a couple of group shows that had like artists, a series of them really, that allowed artists, local artists, access to the U of M's herbarium, which is, you know, it's got all that like plant collections, right? And they made art that responded to that. And then in Manitoba, they have artists in residence up at the Churchill Northern Studies Center, where, you know, there's climate scientists and biologists and geologists, and they all kind of, you know, collaborate. And then there's stuff across Canada with universities, so artists are like going on like ocean-going boats, and there's Beakerhead, which you mentioned, is this big annual science festival in Calgary, which is trying to bring science to the public, and it has it uses art to do that, right? Because that's how you kind of make it sexy and fun, and you know. And there's the Big Bang, what they call the Big Bang residency for like interdisciplinary teams, and they create like a big public artwork, which is kind of cool. And then, okay, the Pelling Lab in Ottawa creates, okay, this is a quotation, living functional biological objects that do not exist in nature, which I'm just speaking as a movie reviewer. That sounds really scary, like kind of sci-fi scary. But anyway, it has artists in residence cooking up.
If it can reproduce. If it can't reproduce.
I don't know. And then there's at the, do you say CERN in Switzerland, the big nuclear, you know, particle accelerator, and they have artists come and work with like nuclear physicists. And then you can work at SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence in California. Like, that would be so cool. Like, are you going to apply? I hope you apply. And then it goes the other way too, right? Because U of M med students, they're encouraged to go to the Winnipeg Art Gallery, and there's these programs where they look at art, and then they talk about art, and they respond to art. And it's the idea is they're going to become more well-rounded people. They're going to become more empathetic, more observant. This is going to make them better doctors. That's the idea, right? And you said also that there are these now in the med school program, there are these programs where you do life drawing, you take poetry, and you taught the life drawing course, right? For, you know, future doctors. So how did that go?
It was weird. It was great. Okay. It was great. Yeah. Like,
I mean, was it different from teaching fine art students?
Oh yeah. Oh my God. It was so interesting. So we'll talk about that. I just want to mention this image that people are seeing.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Only because it relates to everything you're saying. So this is an image. So Melanie Martin was one of the neuroscientists in that project. And in order to finish her PhD thesis, she had to take an image of something biological to demonstrate that her MRI theories worked. Oh, and it just had to be biological. And she ran off to the grocery store and got a piece of broccoli. And this is an MRI.
A broccoli MRI.
And I loved it because she did it for her PhD in physics from Yale. And this is what was okay. So that's a good indication of where the scientist is like, I will solve this anyway. You know, fun, loopy, crazy, playful. That's a real scientist.
Yeah.
Right. So, and then doesn't that look like hyperbolic and brain and everything? Okay, so med students.
Oh, it's really beautiful. Like, it's just beautiful. It's a beautiful image.
It's very floral, yeah.
Like,
so med students and they it was great because they spend all their time. So I was a med student. I went to med school for a while and I left. And I left under strange.
You didn't even tell me that.
Well, because I left, right? So I don't have a medical degree. I have the little badge still that says Seema U of S Medical School, and I still keep it. Like, you're like, look, I could have done that. But you know, I know what that feeling is of being like, everybody starts behind in med school. Mm-hmm. Go, and there's this wave, and you have to absorb tons of things, and there's a lot of people, and everyone's used to being a straight A student, and then there's this competition that's going on at the same time, and it's just tons and tons of material, and it gets thrown into clinic right away too. Sometimes, like, you have to start interviewing patients and developing all these skills that you don't even know, and talking to different kinds of people that you might never have encountered. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of different kinds of stress. there's this academic stress, and then there's also, emotional stress. People have moved here from another place. Like on every level, med students are putting themselves through the worst experience that they possibly can. And the wellness program.
So was this like a refuge for them, or was it another?
I think it was.
Okay.
So
Good.
This program was started by Dr. Jill Horton, who is one of the faculty members, and she also happens to be a writer. So she's a writer and a musician, and she would watch students just like collapse. And so she started this program to get people to have to actually make stuff, actually do things, because the magic of the arts, and every kind, I don't care what kind, whether you're playing the violin or whatever, the magic of it is that you let go of everything else and you enter flow state. And there is nothing wrong. You cannot do anything wrong.
Right.
And that is a tremendous relief. And we need that. That's a really important human thing. So she spoke to me once about how arduous medicine was as an institution and in terms of the schooling process, and that it doesn't actually make sense for what you want at the end, which is a person who's going to help you heal.
Right.
If what you're doing is putting them through this thing that is such an incredible, I would say traumatic, actually.
Yeah.
So the students, I think they took it as a refuge. They certainly were very positive, and they described it like that.
Good.
And their drawing experience was probably frustrating. It was really great for me because I was used to teaching art students or people who already had a lot of, what would you call it? Something invested in drawing. And so instead they would come with nothing, and I would supply all the materials, and we'd have live models. We had great models. And it was also open to other members of the U of M community. So there was an architect who would come, and there was like people would come from several different disciplines. And it was wonderful. It was really wonderful because they weren't trying to, they were just there to be there in the moment. And I think they had a great time. And I think it helps. The main thing that I appreciate about teaching drawing to them was teaching people to observe. So you really have to slow your eye down if you're going to learn how to draw. Yeah. And getting people to just take half an hour to draw your hand, that's really hard. And they would do it. So it was great. Yeah. I hope to do it again. It was really good. It was really tons of fun.
No, that sounds, and do you think, is it just incidental that the doctor was a woman, or do you think it's partly that being a woman, she could see part of that stress and the need for something beyond that?
I don't know. I can't really make that judgment. I mean,
yeah, I know. It's just one. Yeah. Okay.
I don't know. Like, I think the fact that she is also a person who resides in the arts and had a choice at one point of pursuing writing and then figured it out.
Okay.
I think it had a lot to do with that and understanding that people, like we need to maintain outlets. Often medicine absorbs people so fully that they lose track of all the other things they were interested in.
Yeah.
So it's just healthy to have more than one thing to think about.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
do you want to maybe talk about, I'm just thinking about time here because I really want to talk about your work. Okay. Do you want to talk about Science Rendezvous for a little bit? And just like balloon animals? Not balloon animals, balloon helix.
Balloon molecules? Yeah, I'm going to tease everybody. I'm going to tease everybody in case this YouTube exists in the future. Then I'll put up the other slides so they can see them.
And they can look up Bettina Forget.
Okay. I'll talk for 30 seconds. So this is Bettina Forget's work.
Yeah.
I don't know if this happens live for you guys. Whoa, it does. There's the detail. What Bettina did, this is a motion artist. Okay. Yeah. And what she did is she covered her canvas with some kind of goop, probably gesso or something. And then she stuck it in the rain. And those are really the drops of rain making those marks. Okay, so just thinking about how data works and accumulations of data and what we think data is. you know, representations of data. That was an amazing. So Bettina Forget is an amateur astronomist. She owns a gallery in Montreal. She's charming and smart and incredible. She also did this series.
She went to study at one point. She was at the Search for Extraterrestrial Life.
I'm not surprised.
Isn't that cool?
She's going to find it. She's this was another piece she did called Women with Impact, where she looked at the craters of the moon that are named. So there are 1,600 craters that are named, just over 1,600, and only 25 of them, actually I think it's 29. I think I have a typo in this slide, but a small, yeah, it is, it's 29. Anyway, a small number of them are named after women, and the rest of the 1,580 whatever are named after men. And so she did a drawing of each of those craters, and they're beautiful, and they're like not very big. They're maybe 8 by 10 or something. They're so beautiful. And there's a YouTube video if you go to this link where you can watch her do the drawings. They're so lovely because somebody made a documentary about her doing it.
There's something depressing about the idea that we're like taking gender imbalance and like taking it like into outer space. You know, like that's and she has
there was no gender there. No, there's gender imbalance.
And she has talked about like what she finds interesting about STEAM, bringing arts into like, you know, math and tech and all that stuff is she thinks that the approach can be a little more welcoming to women and make science more welcoming for girls and women. So I think that.
And here's a great example. So this is when I was the STEAM coordinator for the Faculty of Science. And that was a wonderful and outrageous position because I just got to figure out how to excite people, right? They don't have a lot of, I never really thought about it, but there aren't a lot of people in the world who actually like have a biology degree, an art degree, and an engineering background, and like can do these things. So, and
went to school for a little while. Yeah,
it was like weird that I got to do this. But one of the things I would set up quite often was a banana keyboard, and this is not my invention. Okay, this is like an off-the-shelf thing, totally off the shelf.
Okay.
But my agenda in STEAM, like Beakerhead, is delight. So I want to get people to be engaged in the subject, whatever it is, through interaction and through using all their other senses. So if I can make them eat something, if I can make them smell something, if I can make them play a game, and especially if I can make them understand this idea of interface as a place of conversation. Right. So I would set up this keyboard, and it's made using something called a makey, which is MAKEY, and then again. And it's produced by some people at MIT, some couple of grad students who came up with it. And it's a little interface. It's like plug and play, okay, into your laptop. Okay. And you wire up all these bananas, and then this is what happens. I don't know if this is going to work. So we have to thank Jeremiah Yarmy. That's his foot and his hand. He was my studio assistant for a while. And so the way this works is that you're completing a circuit. Right? But the banana is the key press. And because the banana has moisture in it, it can actually change what you're doing, like your electricity is flowing through your body. So because the banana can conduct electricity and there's water in it, it allows for the signals to be completed. So that's why his foot was on the screen, because his foot had one end of it, and then he was holding the camera, and then he was tapping the bananas. But basically, those bananas are a key press. But when I show this to people, this is the most like amazing thing, because normally when we think about interface, and when computer scientists think about interface, they are thinking about your screen, your keyboard. Interface is very narrow, so small. Yeah. And when we look at our screen, our wonderful, beautiful smartphone, we, make the image bigger on the iPad, whatever, and we're like, oh, this object is fantastic. But it's the object. When I do this thing with bananas, it's like, oh my God, my hand made that happen. My hand is fantastic. And so I'm always trying to pull it back to say the tech is just a tool. We need to remember Yeah, that we're the fantastic thing, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, you talk about when you're talking about your work, like that wool is a technology. Like we forget, and knitting, like we forget that we tend to think as tech is only this shiny, super shiny, super new, and technology has been with us all along, you know.
Well, and you know, like if you look at the definition of a machine, it's something like anything that transforms, that makes things easier for humans. Something about like changing, reducing the amount of force that humans have to exert.
So dogs, for example, would
dogs are not machines, but like a lever. Okay, so a lever translates one kind of force into another kind of force and makes it easier.
I like dogs, but okay.
But you know, like it can be something very, very, very simple. Technology is actually very simple at its root, and we get so wedded to high tech stuff, and it doesn't really make sense. But Science Rendezvous. So Science Rendezvous was one of the projects that I ran, and my ambition with Science Rendezvous was to turn it into Beakerhead. I have to be honest with you. I still want to have Beakerhead happen somehow. I hope to still be queen of Beakerhead in Winnipeg somehow. But this was a project that started very small, and it grew to welcome 8,000 people in its last festival run of 2019. Where we had 6,000 people come to our public day, and then 2,000 school kids come on our school days. And it's an outreach festival that is entirely run by volunteers at the U of M and the U of W. And we also included the Université de Saint-Boniface and also Red River College. So we would invite students from these 4 different institutions to participate as much as they were willing and able. And then we had a crew of 800 that would run the event.
Wow.
Our 3-day event. And it was super crazy. So the image we're looking at right now is a kid running across a 250 liter trough of cornstarch and water.
Okay.
Yeah. And I didn't put up the video link, but there's also like, it's too bad. There's a video. I have a video of kids mucking around with it. So cornstarch and water, when you mix them together, they become a non-Newtonian fluid. And so they don't behave according to what we anticipate, basically.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, ketchup is also a non-Newtonian fluid. So it makes it fancy when I say.
That explains a lot, actually. Yeah, okay.
That's exactly
All
it.
right.
Right. Yeah. Yes, that's exactly
Gotcha.
it. So, but it was super great because we made this giant trough of it, and I would order 50-pound bags of cornstarch. So I would order 500 pounds of cornstarch, and they would stack up in my office, and it was just crazy. It's crazy stuff, right? And Science Rendezvous was very much a collaborative process where the students would contribute their ideas and take over entirely. And this is the Microbes and Molecules Balloon Station, and the originator of that is smack in the middle with a blue and green balloon on her head. And that's Mahalia LePage. So she was my first STEAM assistant. And she was finishing, I think, her genetics degree. I always get mixed up if it was genetics or biochem. But anyway, she was finishing a degree. And I was chatting with her. This was the first time I ran Science Rendezvous. And I was chatting with her about if only we could make something fun like balloon animals, but maybe, you know, microbes and molecules. And that had been an idea that a professor had mentioned to me. So somebody from Micro, Terry DeKevitt, had mentioned in passing as a joke. And then I mentioned it to Mahalia, and Mahalia said, I know how to make balloon animals. And then she went away, figured out how to make all these different types of balloon animals. And then she did these little cards. I don't know if you can see the cards on the bottom. So each of those cards describes a different kind of microbe or creature. And then those were the different kinds of things they could make. So the one in the middle is a bacteriophage. And just above it, you can see part of a bacteriophage. And if we went back to her, you can see, there's all kinds of things there. There's like DNA twists and bits of helix, and, you know, like there's all kinds of weird stuff. And this, I mean, it was madness. And so you'd see all these little kids walking around with things like a bacteriophage on their head. And they'd have
better than a poodle, better than giraffes. Yeah.
And so it was just this great, like, it was such a great thing to just say, like, look, you can get into this any way you want. You just have to give up your anxiety about, you know, how we communicate and how we represent. What we really need to do is let people know that we're having fun and that we're fun people. We're not scary people.
Okay,
right?
so scientists are your friends.
Yes.
Kind of. Yeah. Okay.
So if you want to see my work, we better skip ahead because there's too much other stuff.
Yeah.
So this was Birds versus Windows, which I was part of as well.
Oh yeah, and this is so great. Yeah, people should look this up because it's so wonderful, and you know, and go birds.
Go birds.
Go birds.
So every year, millions of birds, I think the estimate is 25 million a year in Canada, die due to window strike. And it's an estimate. So it's actually kind of a problem because we don't have very good data for this. But the problem is that for a second. And so in nature, I mean, glass is like clear as water or clear as air, basically, and hard as a rock. Yeah. And so birds are not adapted to that.
Yeah.
And in the spring, they're exhausted. I didn't know birds flew 24 hours a day when they migrate, but many species do. They are, you know, in unusual environments that they're not habituated to, so they don't know the structures around them. In the fall, the birds are young, so they also are extra stupid. And so, you know, it's like they just like they're kids, they're fashion kids. And many, even when a bird hits a window in our home environments, and we think, oh well, the bird flew away later, it's quite likely that the bird dies later, because if it was a hard enough strike, they'll have neurological damage and they'll just die somewhere else. So we were concerned at the university about this issue. And I had been chatting with a couple of different profs, one from biology and one from the Natural Resources Institute, about what we might do. And we decided that we would look, they had been collecting data already. So they knew which buildings from their small set that they'd been looking at so far, they knew which buildings had the highest mortality rates attached to them. And so we put a proposal together for physical plant, and the Dean of Science, the Dean of the Geology, Earth Sciences, and we asked for permission to draw and put vinyl on some of these buildings so that we could make these buildings visible to the birds. Okay. And it was a great project because we I worked with, I think it was 10 or 15 different science students. They were all graduate students on coming up with designs. And then we worked with a graphic designer as well. And they had to learn about design. And it was fantastic. And one of them actually had amazing illustrator skills, like Photoshop skills. So she had come from a design background, but even the conversation about what are we putting on the building, what are the materials we're going to use, how are we going to create this beautiful image, how are we going to get it out into the world, all that stuff was fantastic, because it really situated this as a place of problem solving. So we don't tend to, in the rest of the world, I believe, that people don't think of the arts as an area of problem solving, but it's super intense problem solving, right? It's like logistical, it's material, it's you know, cleanup, it's application, it's what's going to be non-toxic, you know, all those different layers, and then also navigating all the public infrastructure things and making sure no one's going to be angry with us, and then coming up with text maybe. So in this image is of an Archaeopteryx, which was drawn onto the building. Yeah, it was drawn onto the building with liquid chalk. And we had 5 or 6.
The link between dinosaurs and birds, the Archaeopteryx?
It is, yes, exactly. And so they chose this image, and that is the building that houses the dinosaurs. That's the one with that fossil collection.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. So they did this great.
So that's a meaningful link, right?
Yeah, definitely a meaningful link. We also made sure they were in places where it might not have the best visual exposure for humans, but would have the most effect on the issue of reducing bird strike. Yeah, so we're trying to also make sure the science part was being rewarded and thought out. And so on one building we did a drawing, And on another building, we did vinyl.
Mhm.
And we had to come up with text. And so we had to come up with, limited, quick language
Mhm.
that could be understandable as to why we were doing this. It was interesting because at the beginning, one of the science people wanted to have this big text panel. It was like all about what happens with birds, da, da, da. And I just said, like, you need a tagline, like it's a bumper sticker.
Slogan.
And then I said, if you need all that text, no problem, but we'll just cover the whole wall with text. That's vinyl. We don't need to make a panel, like a cardstock panel. We don't need to give anything out. Use the fact that you have text. That text can be your image. Go ahead, go crazy, make it gigantic. Cover a building with text then. And that kind of challenge to what they were used to thinking about was, again, like another excellent moment. And even the imagery we chose, so in this case, we chose all these bird feathers. We made sure we talked to the Native Studies people, that we spoke to an elder, that we made sure we were thinking about imagery and how it's used. And that's another good step for people to remember, right? Like you always have to think about, what does your imagery mean? So
the cultural implications.
Yeah. And then eventually that
multidisciplinary then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Including it was crazy. It was great. And then it turned into a course. So from this, the problem that we learned from the biologists was data collection is really hard. So we think 25 million birds die every year. Could be 5 million. It's not less than 5 million. Could be 10 million. Could be 20 million. Might actually be like 30 million. Like the range is way too big. So the literature says we know for sure that there's a lower boundary of 20%, but we estimated it at this much higher level. And it's because birds fly away, so we don't know.
Right.
Other animals come and eat them, predation, or nobody's there to notice, right? Yeah. And then even if you do notice, where do you upload this data?
Yeah. So
there's lots of reasons that we would have no idea.
Yeah.
So I was fortunate enough to be having a conversation with a couple of physics profs, Wouter DeConnick and Jacob Burgess, about a completely different project. And I mentioned this lack of data about birds hitting windows. And they came up in 10 minutes, they came up with a whole bunch of physics ways to do it. Oh, we can do this, we could do up this kind of sensor, we could try this thing, like whatever, piezo's and accelerometers and all this. And one of them, and Wouter just said, let's do a course. And he wrote up a syllabus and he submitted it. And in January, there was a course. And that allowed for lots of different students from many different disciplines to participate in this project. And we approached that question of how do we collect data? So
sorry, you cut out there for a sec for me anyway.
Okay, you were stuck for me, so I wasn't sure. We might have had a missed moment there.
I think we did.
So so we developed a course, and that allowed for students from many different disciplines to work together to try and figure out how they could collect that data.
Okay.
And they came up with great strategies, and it was just amazing because it was like a real world problem. And they came up with real world solutions, and they even implemented some of them. So that was fantastic. Okay, so we have 6 minutes to talk about my work.
Well, we can maybe stretch out, but let's do murmur. Is this murmur?
No, this is how this started.
Okay.
But I could just jump to murmur.
No, we can do this.
Okay, so this is at the beginning when I mentioned Margaret and Unknown Sister's name from Coral Reef Project, and I said I better look it up, that I was gonna do this project in Dublin. This was the project, and it was called the Carbon Footprint Project. It was commissioned by the lovely Weather Residency.
Right. Yes. Okay.
By the County Council, and it asked artists to work with the public, talk to the public somehow, get them to talk about climate change. And I went up there and learned a lot about sheep. So I didn't know anything about, I knew a lot about climate change because I have an ecology degree. But when I was asked to like, okay, come up with something that you're going to do with people in Ireland, and I had to, it was a call for submissions and all this. The thing that I did was I actually, I went into my closet and I pulled out my Donegal sweater. So I was living in Saskatchewan, right? And I had this sweater that I knew was a Donegal sweater, and I pulled it out and I looked at the tag, and the tag said, "Made by American Eagle in, I think it was Indonesia." And I realized at that moment that I had something fantastic in my hands, because I had this thing that was just all about contradiction, right? So a lot of my work is about contradiction, or like opening contradictions and saying, look, this doesn't make any sense. Isn't it weird that we do this? How can we do this? This doesn't make any sense. So when I went to Ireland, I went and I stayed at a sheep farm for a while. And that man in blue in the middle unfolding one fleece, that's the sheep farmer whose home I stayed at. That's Merv Norris.
Okay.
And that's the fleece. That's one fleece. That's one sheep. Okay, so that's 3.5.
A lot bigger than I would have thought.
They have a lot of wool. So I went and I learned a lot about wool. I learned that wool is a waste product, that there's no economic value for the farmer. I learned that the farmer has to spend more on the shearing than they get at the market for it, that nobody uses the wool locally, that it has a depressed value, and that people, when they're knitting with, people tend to knit with acrylic. And when they are knitting with wool, they're using merino from New Zealand. So I discovered all these like crazy things that were happening.
Yeah.
And I didn't know how to spin anymore. You know, like we have all these like marvelous nostalgic things about Ireland.
We do.
Irish, but and so I went up there. I learned a lot about textiles, and I do actually come from a textiles family, but it's pretty far removed. So I didn't grow up with a heightened sense of textiles, but it was funny because later it seemed very relevant. And the last spinning wheel maker in all of Ireland happened to live in this little village that I was stationed in. And he's sitting in that image as well. He's with the spinning wheel, because that's Johnny Shields. And he made drop spindles for me. And I went off and taught members of the community how to spin wool. And we talked about wool and all the material value of it, how easy it is to spin, that it comes from the land. We talked about it as a type of portrait of the landscape. We talked about it as a form of carbon capture, because it is a certain, 44% carbon by mass. We talked about local materials. I set up a studio. Hundreds of people learned how to spin. I went into schools and did all this crazy stuff. I had a baby in all of that too, and I walked around my little baby like strapped to me. My child grew up with wool from the get-go. He had wool everywhere, and it was a fantastic marrying of art and science, because it's the first time that I made a work where the science didn't get in the, like, usually when we try to do something that feels like they're opposite, we fight, each part of them fights. But this was a piece where I never was like, oh my God, we're going to experience climate change, because that would just scare people, right? I would just start by talking about wool. And they would talk about how they grew up with sheep all around them, and none of them knew how to spin. None of them had ever used the wool. What was the wool for? And we would get a fleece from the local market, from Merv, down the road, and start carting it and making stuff. And then gradually we'd start talking about it. And we'd start talking about local materials, microeconomies, and the value of labor, and the history of this material. And then Gandhi came up, right? The history of spinning as an action, spinning as a form of political revolution. But yeah, like the whole idea of somebody taking away your autonomy to make your own clothing and moving that to China or to India or to another country, and how economics is not actually wedded to value. So we also talked about the idea of cost. So there's money cost, and then there's the real cost, the cost of society. And this town, the environmental costs, all of it. And this town of Carndunna was emptying out, like so many towns were at that time in 2010, because it was the recession in Ireland. So we also held a spin-in where we took over the empty shop fronts of the village, and I taught all these people to spin, and they were in the windows, little kids, like 10-year-old kids spinning with their parents. And it was this great moment where we were like, this is it, we're having a spin-in, Gandhi, you know, like, it was pretty funny. And I hadn't even realized that I was doing this kind of Gandhi thing until somebody pointed it out. One of these Irishmen pointed it out to me. It's like, oh, right, I'm Indian. Oh, right. Yeah. And they also thought it was very funny that this girl from Canada had to come and get them to connect with each other and use the wool from down the road.
Yeah, yeah.
It was really hilarious. So that piece made me aware of the appetite of the public for the art science connection and ways of involving people where they weren't going to be afraid.
Right.
And if we look at, it's like, there's only one piece in here that's actually from the show, but on the far right, there's a pair of socks. And that pair of socks was made by one of the participants. What we did is we all spun wool, however many people were part of the studio. And then at the end, we had a show in Donegal, and all the people who wanted to could make things out of the wool that they'd spun. And this pair of socks has a graph of the GDP on one sock and a graph of the CO2 emissions on the other sock. So one thing that I did is that I looked at the data of the GDP and the carbon dioxide levels and discovered that they overlap completely. And I had a mathematician actually look at all the data to make sure that my values were correct, and that my statistics were correct. But we as part of our ambition, it was to say, you know, if we want to affect climate change, the thing we need to do is we need to separate these two things. We need to understand that our GDP cannot be connected to the carbon dioxide increase. So our problem is that it's not just that we're dependent on fossil fuels, it's that everything is so hyper embedded in structures that promote that, right? So we also, you know, we would look at current textiles, and current textiles they might traverse the ocean 3 times before they go to a buyer.
Right.
So something might be grown in one country, it might be spun and dyed in another country, it might actually move again and be cut into fabric in another country, and then it might go to a buyer in a 4th place. And that might be all the way across from like China to India. It might even start in the States. It might be grown in the States. Grown in the States, goes to China, gets spun, goes to India, gets dyed, comes to Canada, gets sold.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Wasteful.
So, and very wasteful, right? And there are so many layers in there. So we kind of unpacked this massive textile industry. And it for me, it was the first time that I'd thought about textiles in that context. So it was pretty amazing for me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oops, sorry, I'm jiggling the camera by accident. And so Murmur is sort of the other end.
I love Murmur.
Okay, so this is a picture of Flock Together, but you want to see Murmur, so let's go to Murmur. So Murmur is similarly wool. I became a wool junkie. Like full on, I went from being a glass blower and a ceramics person, like all hard. Just think about how hard those materials are. Like complete and utter wool junkie. I had 30 kilos of wool in my house at one point, and my fellow was so annoyed with me because it's smelly. Anyway, so when I came back to Canada, some of this is made of Irish wool. When I came back to Canada and I started this project with I started as an artist in residence in the Faculty of Science. I wanted to make these big, I wanted to make stones actually. And I ended up making these. And these are like, for me, they're like erratics on the landscape. You know, those giant boulders that the buffalo used to rub on. And
that have been deposited by glaciers, right?
Yeah, yeah. Okay. And I was thinking a lot about how the land is an echo of everything that's come before, and that things absorb meanings, and how if those rocks could speak to me, they would speak about that rubbing. You know, you would be able to feel the buffalo rubbing. So I got very romantic about these ideas. and I made these giant things. But in order to make them,
Mm-hmm.
I had to felt giant pieces of wool. So I laid out basically a room of wool. I made friends with a lot of wool farmers in Manitoba. And that in the back there, you can see on the right-hand image on the back, you can see me laying out the wool. And in the foreground is a basket that I basically made out of willow.
Okay,
and,
so that's the frame, the skeleton.
Yeah, that's the frame. And the felting component was, how wide would that have been? Maybe 15 feet wide by 20 feet long. And then we would lay it out outside, and the image on the left is us starting to felt it. So we lay it out inside and then sort of pat it all together and then take it out.
Felting is really picky work, though, isn't it? Didn't it take forever?
Well, this is wet felting. And this is unusual. Like, you know, when you don't know that you can't do something and then you do it because
okay.
Right? Yeah. So I have a long history of making things like that, where I'm like, I'm going to make 9 giant pots on the wheel that are 10 feet tall. Well, they weren't 10 feet. They were 6 feet. 6 feet tall. And nobody says no. So I'm like, okay. And then I've made 9 giant pots that are 6 feet tall on the wheel, throwing on a ladder. And then later on, someone says, that was nuts. No one told me I shouldn't do that. So I did that, right? So this was similar. It never really dawned on me that felting a giant thing by hand of that scale was a little bit nuts. So we just did it. No one told us not to. And then we stretched it, so it becomes this big felted carpet, basically.
Right.
And we stretched it across an armature, that armature, and then I sewed it in all with handmade string that I'd made. And
but then it's also interactive, right? Like
so we can
there's
hear
a technological component too, right? Which is kind of unexpected, I think, because it is so big and woolly, right?
They're big and woolly, and you can go inside them. So there you can see someone's feet. Yeah. And they're meant to be things you touch, right? So unlike most things in the gallery, this is intended for you to interact with.
Right.
And again, it's the interface. So these, I wanted them to purr when you interacted with them. I have one sound here. Let's see if we play this. So there were a series of sounds, and they would respond according to how the viewer or the participant reacted to them. So if you petted them softly, then they would make nice sounds. And if you were mean to them, they would growl at you.
Well, who would be mean to? Who could be mean to?
Actually, nobody was. Well, some probably were, but in the gallery, you know, people are restrained. And then if you were inside, it would purr constantly. It would just make this little low rumbling happen. And this was a great project because I got to work with computer science students and engineering students. And the problem was, how do you create something that's touch sensitive that is an insulator? So your screen on your smartphone, you know, where you go zoop, zoop and all that, that's working on a field, on an electrical field with a capacitance field. And your body, when you touch it, is changing. It's like making a depression point in that. So you're changing something electrical on the surface of that.
Oh, right. But if you have a mitten on, it doesn't work, right?
Because the mitten, yes, because your body, your electrical system won't go through. But also with wool, well, like even if I wanted to run copper wiring all through this thing,
right?
Well, it won't. I can't complete the circuit the way I did in the banana, because wool is an insulator. And so I had to figure out, how were we going to make these touch sensitive? And it was a great problem, because you know, when you come up with, artists come up with the best problems. So when you approach an engineer and you say, I need this thing to do this, they're like, that is just stupid. Why would you do that? That's the wrong material for that. If you want something to be touch responsive, you make it out of this instead. None of this makes any sense. And you're like, right, it doesn't make any sense. How do we do it? This is a real problem. And there was and I had been chatting with somebody about using microphones as an idea. And then I happened to meet a graduate student in engineering. That was his whole thing. He was like, yeah, you can do that with a microphone. And he put me on to the right people. And we built our own sensors based on tiny, tiny microphones. And then we had a microcontroller inside it. And I worked with some computer science students to figure out how to translate that touch into a particular threshold. So depending on how you touch that thing, it would perceive different amounts of sound. And then that sound would go into the microcontroller and it would say, right, it's peaked at this threshold level or this threshold level. And depending on whatever that level was, it would emit it would go to a specific file.
Right.
Say, emit this sound. So it was a really great challenge.
Yeah.
And then
for
everybody, yeah. And then it was also like I needed to have
collaborative, right? I mean,
very much, yeah.
Yeah, because you talked before about like the idea that artists shouldn't just illustrate, for scientists, but that also that artists shouldn't just go to scientists and say, just do this exactly how I want it, but that it becomes more interesting when everyone's bringing something and maybe arguing, and then it's you don't quite know what's going to happen until you're actually in there, and and then you get something that nobody could have
done that. Like, first, this could never have come out of just my brain.
Right.
So it absolutely depended on, and it also wasn't the thing I imagined at the beginning. So that's one of the things I really like about art and science as something the things that are similar, that, you start off on one thing and then you start working and then you come up with new problems and you realize like, that's not actually going to happen. And you try different materials, you try different paths, and then something new happens along the way that's better than the first idea.
Right.
It's way better than what I first thought of. Like so many times better than what I first thought of. And it needed that challenge. It needed to fail at different points. And it needed lots of people's thinking. And lots of people saying like, what about trying this? And what about trying that? And, oh, we made the basket. Oh, it's sort of squashed. Hey, that's weird. What if there was an opening here? How do we do this? And just allowing that kind of play. And then within that science and engineering part too, I would never have dreamed of that stuff. I had this inkling of it, but like certainly not what happened. And the grad student who did the most work on that, Stella Seo, he ended up doing this great piece for science. Well, he did it for his graduate work, but we used it in Science Rendezvous. It was a stuffed snake, like a stuffy snake, like a toy snake that would translate acoustics into paintings. And so you could give it a song, like any song you wanted, like Hey Jude, and it would listen to the song, and then it would make a painting. And it was this translation, right? It was like saying this note equals this thing or this phrase, etc. But that stuff correlated with what Stella did for me with this threshold. And I was so happy that, however we worked together, it gave him an idea somewhere that made him think in a different way. And I remember his advisor was at first a little bit skeptical of the whole thing. And then later he did the snake thing. And then it won an award.
Do we really need a snake? Does
No,
it have to be a snake?
like, Seema, you're in here, you're using my grad students' time, this is not going to help them. And I was like using them entirely. And I was there a lot. I was really bugging them. And they were so sweet to me. And then Stella did this great piece. He did this snake, and then the snake entered into some art science competition somewhere, robotics competition, because he was a robotics guy. And it won. And then after that, it was like, oh yeah, maybe people are interested in this weird thing. And I don't know if it advances science, but it was certainly a lot of fun for them. And it made people be interested in science. So in that way, I think it advances science. Okay. And the other piece, that was like that was this. Let me see if I can play this. I'm gonna.
Ooh. Wow.
So this is a piece using emergent systems math, but it also is a type of, it's a responsive projection. So I did it in collaboration with a student, and you can see one of the murmur pieces.
Oh, okay, so it responds to the person in the gallery.
Yeah, so as the person walks around in the gallery, those little birds, they break apart and fly around in a specific pattern, specific movements, and then they come back together. And so that piece was done with he was an undergrad at the time, Brendan, and we worked, like, I would never have been able, not just technically not been able to make that piece without him, but I wouldn't have imagined that piece the way it turned out without him. So that, so I made all these little paper cedar waxwings, and then that were collaged, and then I would take them apart and take a photograph of each of those little pieces and turn it into its own little identity. And then he created an animation program, which was whack, man, that was crazy. And then I had to animate all those little birds as their little, like, you know, gestures. Then he took that whole thing and he put it back into a program that would make them break apart and dance around. And within all of that, there was another program that was looking for the viewer in the room. And when the viewer walked past, it would line it up with where the birds were on the wire. So there was this robotic vision program, and then there was this other animation program. And you know, that was another great example of the art and science actually making sense together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to have to wrap it up. And is it also, like, I mean, it's that question of, like, how do those birds fly around and not bonk into each other, right? That's kind of what.
Yeah. So that's why people are interested in emergent system stuff, and or one of the reasons.
Yeah.
And you know, one of my things that I'm often interested in is how do humans use nature? And we got excited about. We've been looking at starlings fly around for a long time, but we didn't really care about what the math was until we had to figure out how we could make drones fly and not bash into each other.
That's depressing, but
or how to make self-driving cars drive without hitting each other.
Right.
You know? So there's but that's a good question to have to notice that. When we use nature and what's going on.
Okay. Should we just end on this incredible work that we're looking at right now?
Should. That's why.
I think yes. I think we should. I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right.
This is another person's work. This is Katie Patterson, and several years ago she did a piece where she wanted to set up a live feed to a glacier, so you could hear it. So you could hear it dripping. So you could just hear the glacier, and she set up a phone line. So you could call the glacier. And the sound file here is actually a long conversation. So I will just let people go to the website if they want to hear it. But you can hear it, like, dripping and crackling. And in terms of our present awareness of ecological collapse, big glaciers have become a symbol. But we don't have a lot of connection to them, right? Because they're so big and so far away, and we know them as a thing that leaves giant boulders on the landscape. So her gesture, where you could pick up something as intimate as your phone, which maybe you keep in your pocket or on your body or in your hand, like really a hand thing. And then you do this weird thing where you dial into space and through space, and then you hear something specific that's real and live, and it's dripping. And it's that giant, giant structure dissolving, dripping, melting. That it was like so remarkable and poignant and powerful as a communication, like not just a communication moment, but like a communication coup.
Yeah, taking the kind of abstract idea that climate change is here and making it into this connected moment.
Yeah, and actually, and connected is the right word, right? Where you're actually connected with your ear.
Yeah.
So again, this ephemeral sense, very ephemeral sense, and it's lovely. And so just to note that there's a real value in traversing this conversation of art and science, and to remember that how we view things is an opportunity more than anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Seema, for sharing your insight and your wealth of knowledge about everything, as far as I can tell. And thank you to everyone. Thank you to Collective Broadcast Co. And you can reach them at collectivebroadcastco@gmail.com if for your communication needs. I would just like to invite people, even in this time when a lot of galleries aren't open or they're open in different ways, please check out the online programming. Many of the exchange artist-run centers, many First Friday participants are open safely or maintaining an active online presence with exhibits, music performances, presentations, workshops, art challenges. So you can find out more information on that at firstfridayswinnipeg.org. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Seema. And good night.
Thank you so much for having me. Good night.
Thanks.